Her mother sold her. For less than a used car. Not to strangers. Not to criminals. To a Korean mafia boss. Who doesn't keep people alive? Nancy didn't beg. Didn't cry. Because when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one who trades you, you stop believing anyone will save you. She was already marked for death before she even arrived. But when he lifted her face and saw the bruises, he froze. Not anger. Not desire. Recognition. And in that moment, the deal was no longer a deal. It became something far more dangerous. Because the most feared man in the city was about to break his own rules. And the woman who sold her? She didn't just lose a daughter. She started a war she couldn't survive. The air smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. A storm was coming, but inside the ginseng estate, the silence was louder than thunder. Nancy Wendling stood on the polished wood floors. A young woman who had already died inside. Her natural curls were matted with rain. Her lip was split, a parting gift from the woman who gave her life. She didn't look up. She didn't beg. There was no point in pleading with a man of steel. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't even a prisoner. She was a line item. A payment for a mother's greed. Because 3 days ago, a decision was made. Not to save their home. Not to pay for medicine. But to fund a seat at a high-stakes table. And now, Nancy was at the mercy of the King of Shadows. A man who followed the code of the underworld. A man who showed no mercy to the weak. But as Tae Jinsang stepped into the light, his eyes didn't hold cruelty. They held recognition. The world expected a slaughter. But the monster was about to do the one thing no one saw coming. He was about to protect her. The tires hissed against the rain-slicked pavement, a rhythmic, cruel sound that mirrored the ticking of a clock Nancy knew was running out. Inside the back of the black sedan, the air was thick with the scent of cheap vinyl and the metallic tang of her own dried blood. Outside, Chicago was a blur of neon blues and electric oranges, the city lights bleeding across the window glass like spilled ink. Nancy leaned her forehead against the cold pane, watching the world pass by, a world she was no longer a part of. She wasn't a girl anymore. She wasn't a student, a friend, or even a person. In her mother's eyes, she had finally achieved her ultimate form. She was a settlement. The weight of the betrayal felt heavier than the zip ties biting into her wrists. Nancy closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back in their cramped kitchen 3 days ago. She could still hear the wet slap of her mother's hand across her face, still see the frantic, glazed look in the older woman's eyes, the look of a gambler who had lost everything and was looking for one last chip to toss onto the table. "You've always been a burden, Nancy," her mother had hissed, her voice a venomous cocktail of desperation and greed. "It's time you finally paid your way." Nancy wondered if there was a specific ledger in the underworld for daughter. What was the current exchange rate for 20 years of shared meals and forced smiles? Apparently, it was exactly equal to a gambling debt held by the Ginseng organization. The driver made a sharp turn, the G-force pressing Nancy's bruised shoulder against the door. She didn't flinch. Pain was an old acquaintance, but this new silence was terrifying. The man in the passenger seat hadn't looked at her once. To him, she was just cargo, a delicate, damaged parcel that needed to be delivered before the storm broke. She thought of Tae Jinsang. She had heard the whispers in the neighborhood, the King of Shadows, a man who carved his empire out of silence and steel. He was the end of the line. People like Nancy didn't go to the Ginseng estate to live, they went there to be erased. As the sedan slowed, approaching the towering iron gates of a sprawling industrial-style fortress, Nancy felt a strange, hollow calmness wash over her. If she was nothing more than currency, then this was the moment she was finally spent. She watched the rain wash over the dark bricks of the estate, wondering if the man inside would be the one to finally break what little was left of her, or if he would simply let her vanish into the shadows of the city that had already turned its back on her. The gates groaned open, swallowing the car whole, and Nancy Windling prepared herself to meet the man who now owned her life. The heavy iron gates hissed shut behind the sedan, a sound that felt like the teeth of a trap clicking into place. As Nancy was led from the car, the rain intensified, cold needles piercing through her thin sweater, but the chill of the exterior was nothing compared to the atmosphere of the estate itself. This was the House of Ghosts, a sprawling, minimalist fortress of concrete, glass, and shadow that loomed over the edge of the city like a silent sentinel. Inside, the transition was jarring. There was no noise. No shouting henchmen, no clinking bottles, no chaotic energy of a criminal empire. Instead, there was an oppressive, clinical silence. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the dim, recessed lighting like a dark lake. The walls were bare, stripped of any warmth or art, save for the occasional shadow cast by a structural pillar. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum built for the living. Nancy's sneakers squeaked against the stone, the sound echoing unnervingly in the vast, open space. Every step felt like an intrusion. The guards who flanked her didn't speak, they moved with a synchronized, ghostly grace that suggested they were more extensions of the building than men. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, but the stillness of the house seemed to demand her submission. It was a place designed to make a person feel small, disposable, and entirely alone. As they moved deeper into the heart of the estate, the air grew warmer, scented faintly of sandalwood and expensive ink, yet the dread in Nancy's gut only sharpened. She passed floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a courtyard where the rain lashed against a single, twisted maple tree. It looked as lonely as she felt. There were no signs of life in the rooms they passed. Only sharp angles and expensive, hollow spaces. It was a minimalist purgatory. Her mother had sold her to a man who lived in a void, and Nancy feared that she was meant to fill that void with her own disappearance. They reached a set of towering double doors made of dark, heavy timber. The guards stopped, their expressions unreadable as one of them placed a hand on the handle. Nancy swallowed hard, the copper taste of her split lip reminding her of the reality she couldn't escape. This was the threshold. Beyond these doors sat the man who had bought her silence. In this house of ghosts, she realized with a shuddering breath, she was the only thing that still felt the haunting ache of being alive. The doors swung open without a sound, revealing a room bathed in a low, golden glow that felt more like a warning than a welcome. The room was bathed in the amber glow of a single crystal chandelier, but the warmth of the light failed to reach the man sitting behind the massive desk of polished obsidian. Tae Jinsang did not look like a monster, he looked like a god of industry. His black suit was tailored with lethal precision, and his dark hair was swept back, revealing a sharp, composed face that seemed carved from granite. But it was the tattoos climbing his neck, dark, intricate ink that disappeared beneath his collar. That whispered the truth of who he really was. He didn't look up when the doors opened. He was focused on a man kneeling on the floor across from him, a mid-level associate who was trembling so violently that his teeth audibly chattered. Jinsang was currently holding a heavy gold fountain pen, rotating it slowly between his fingers. On the desk lay a ledger and a small, velvet-lined box. "I don't value excuses, Minho," Jinsang said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the sound of a judge delivering a sentence he had already forgotten. "I value the equilibrium of my accounts. You shifted the balance. Now, I must shift it back. Please, boss," the man wheezed, his face pale against the dark floor. "The shipment was seized by the port authorities. I couldn't have known." Jinsang finally looked up. His eyes were dark, flat pools of glass that reflected nothing. He didn't raise his voice, but the air in the room seemed to vanish. "You knew the risk. You accepted the responsibility. In my world, knowing is the only thing that keeps you breathing." He gestured slightly with his hand, a movement so subtle it was almost graceful. "Take him to the basement. He can explain the concept of unforeseen circumstances to the concrete." As the guards dragged the sobbing man away, Jinsang didn't blink. He simply uncapped his pen and made a neat, clinical mark in his ledger, crossing out a name as if he were deleting a typo. The efficiency was chilling. To him, human lives were just variables in an equation of power. He was the king of shadows, a man who had long ago traded his pulse for a crown of ice. He lived in the silence of his own making, untouchable and unfeeling. He closed the ledger with a soft thud and finally turned his gaze toward the doorway where Nancy stood, shivering and broken. He didn't move. He simply watched her, his expression a mask of cold authority, as if he were deciding whether she was a new asset to be managed or just another error to be erased. The silence that followed the associate's departure was heavier than the storm outside. Jinsang rose from his desk, his movements fluid and predatory, the gold watch on his wrist catching the amber light. Nancy stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat as the king of shadows crossed the room. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, watching the reflection of his black leather shoes approach until they stopped directly in front of her. The air around him was cold, smelling of rain and expensive cedarwood. Nancy braced herself, her shoulders hunching in anticipation of the violence she had come to accept as her only language. She waited for a strike, for the rough hands of a man who had just sent a subordinate to a concrete grave. Instead, she felt the ghost of a touch, 2 fingers, steady and cool, pressing firmly beneath her chin. Slowly, Jinsang forced her head up. Nancy had no choice but to meet his gaze. His eyes were sharp, scanning her face with a clinical intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. But as his gaze traveled over her, the rhythmic tapping of his thumb against her jaw stopped. He saw the bruise blooming like a dark flower across her cheekbone. He saw the jagged, vertical split in her lower lip that was still weeping a thin trail of red. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the specific shape of the injury. The telltale mark of a heavy ring, a signature of domestic cruelty he recognized with a sudden, jarring clarity. For the first time since she had entered the House of Ghosts, the mask of the monster slipped. A flicker of something raw and unscripted ignited in Jinsang's dark pupils. It wasn't pity, it was a cold, shimmering recognition. His grip didn't tighten, but his thumb brushed almost imperceptibly against the edge of the split lip. Nancy flinched, a small, broken sound escaping her throat, her wide eyes filling with a fresh wave of terror. She expected him to laugh at her weakness or finish what her mother had started. Instead, Jinsang's jaw tightened, the muscles corded and hard. He turned his head slightly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Who did this?" Nancy's voice was a mere shadow. The woman who sold me. My mother." The room seemed to grow colder as Jinsang's eyes returned to hers. The indifference that had defined him just moments ago was gone, replaced by a focused, terrifying purpose. He didn't call for a guard to take her to the basement. He didn't return to his ledger. "Your mother didn't sell a debt," Jinsang whispered, his fingers lingering on her chin as if anchoring her to the world. "She sold me a mirror." He stepped back, his expression snapping back into a mask of lethal composure, but the fire in his eyes remained. "Get the medic. And tell my driver to keep the car running. I have a new account to settle." The medical wing of the estate was as sterile and silent as the rest of the house, but the harsh fluorescent lights felt like a mercy compared to the shadows of the study. Nancy sat on the edge of an examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her as a woman in a white coat moved with efficient, silent grace, cleaning the dried blood from her lip. Jinsang stood by the window, his back to her, watching the rain lash against the reinforced glass. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white shirt was stretched tight across his shoulders, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse in the rhythmic light of the city. For a long time, he didn't speak, and the only sound was the soft clink of medical instruments. "Your mother thinks she sold you to me because of a gambling debt," Jinsang said finally, his voice cutting through the clinical quiet. He didn't turn around. "She thinks she found a clever way to erase her mistakes by handing me a soul." Nancy flinched as the medic applied a stinging antiseptic. Isn't that why I'm here?" Jinsang turned then, his silhouette framed by the dark storm outside. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable, but the cold indifference that had defined him earlier was gone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a weathered, silver Zippo lighter. He didn't light it, he simply turned it over in his large hand, the metal clicking softly. 20 years ago, a man named Elias Windling saved my life in a district where no one survives without a price, he whispered. Nancy froze, her breath catching. My father? He was the only man in this city who didn't look at a tattoo and see a monster, Jinsang continued, his eyes fixing on hers with a weight that felt like a physical pressure. He was a good man. A man who deserved better than the woman he married. He stepped closer, the light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. I didn't accept your mother's debt because I needed the money, Nancy. I accepted it because I've been looking for Elias's daughter since the day he was taken from us. I knew she would eventually try to sell you. I just didn't realize she would wait until she had broken you first. The mystery of his reaction finally clicked into place, a jagged piece of a puzzle Nancy hadn't known she was part of. This wasn't a random transaction. It was a long-awaited reclamation. You're not a payment, Nancy, Jinsang said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. You're a debt of honor. And in my world, we pay our debts in blood. He turned to the medic, his face snapping back into a mask of lethal command. Finish up. She needs to be ready. We're going to find her mother, and I want Nancy to see exactly what happens to people who betray the memory of a friend. The room Nancy was led to was nothing like the damp, cramped basement she had occupied for the last 3 days. It was a vast, airy suite finished in soft charcoals and warm woods, high up in the quietest wing of the estate. A fire crackled in a minimalist hearth, casting a flickering, amber glow across a bed that looked like a cloud of white linen. On the mahogany sideboard sat a tray of steaming food, rich broth, fresh bread, and fruit that looked too perfect to be real. The female attendant who had guided her didn't speak, but her touch was gentle as she laid out a set of soft, silk pajamas and a heavy cashmere robe. When the door clicked shut, leaving Nancy alone, the silence didn't feel like a threat. For the first time in her life, the quiet felt like a shield. Nancy moved toward the bathroom, her reflection in the full-length mirror making her stop in her tracks. She saw a girl she barely recognized, eyes wide and haunted, skin marked by the cruelty of the woman who should have loved her. She peeled off the wet, tattered sweater, the last physical link to her mother's betrayal, and stepped into a shower that ran with water so hot it felt like it could wash away the very memory of the sedan ride. When she emerged, wrapped in the oversized robe, the scent of expensive soap clinging to her skin, she sat at the edge of the bed. Her hands shook as she reached for a piece of bread. She took a bite, the warmth of the food spreading through her chest, and suddenly, the dam broke. It wasn't a loud, hysterical sob. It was a quiet, shaking release. Nancy cried for the father she had lost, for the mother who had seen her as a chip to be played, and for the terrifying, tattooed man downstairs who had looked at her scars and seen his own history. She waited for the moment of fear to return, the wait for the next blow, the next scream, but it didn't come. She looked at the heavy timber door. It wasn't locked from the outside. There were no zip ties, no guards inside the room, no threats echoing in the hallway. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Tae Jinsang hadn't put her in a cell. He had built her a sanctuary. For the first time since she was a child, the constant, vibrating tension in her muscles began to dissolve. She curled up on top of the covers, the warmth of the fire lulling her into a heavy, dreamless state. She was still in the lion's den, but as her eyes drifted shut, Nancy realized that the lion was the only thing standing between her and the wolves that had hunted her since birth. She wasn't just a witness, she was a survivor, and for tonight, she was finally safe. The neon sign of the Golden Dragon Casino buzzed with a frantic, artificial energy, casting a sickly green light over the sidewalk. Inside, the air was a thick haze of expensive tobacco and desperation, a world where Nancy's mother, Evelyn, felt more at home than she ever had in her own kitchen. She clutched her designer handbag to her chest, the weight of the cash inside the price of her daughter's life, feeling like a warm, pulsing heart. Evelyn moved through the crowded floor with a predatory grace, her eyes glazed with the fever of a winning streak she believed was her destiny. She didn't feel the cold dampness of the rain she had left outside, and she certainly didn't notice the 2 men in charcoal overcoats who had followed her from the moment she stepped out of her apartment. They moved like shadows, blending into the background of flashing lights and chiming machines, their expressions as unreadable as the stone walls of the Jinsang estate. She took a seat at a high-stakes baccarat table, her hands trembling as she began to stack the crisp, high-denomination bills. To Evelyn, this wasn't blood money, it was freedom. It was the chance to finally erase the years of bad luck and the burden of a daughter who had only ever reminded her of her failures. She ordered a glass of the most expensive scotch on the menu, a smug smile playing on her lips as she watched the dealer's hands. "Maximum bet," she chirped, her voice cutting through the low hum of the room with a syrupy, forced confidence. She was so consumed by the cards, so intoxicated by the possibility of doubling her earnings, that she missed the way the pit boss looked over his shoulder toward the entrance. She didn't see the enforcer standing by the bar, a man with a jagged scar across his eyebrow, who was currently speaking into a small radio tucked into his sleeve. Evelyn won the first hand, then the second. She laughed, a shrill, brittle sound that drew eyes from across the room. She felt untouchable, convinced that the universe had finally rewarded her for her sacrifice. She had no idea that every chip she won was being logged, every move she made was being transmitted back to the dark study where Tae-Jin-sang sat waiting. As she reached for the cards of her third hand, a shadow fell across the green felt of the table. For a split second, a cold shiver of genuine intuition rippled down Evelyn's spine, a ghost of the same fear she had spent years inflicting on Nancy. She looked up, expecting to see a waiter, but found only the cold, dead gaze of the man in the charcoal coat. He wasn't there to play. He was there to watch the money. And as the dealer revealed a losing hand, the shadow didn't move. The trap hadn't just been set, it was already beginning to close. The rain had tapered off into a persistent, ghostly mist by the time Nancy found herself back in the study. She stood by the massive obsidian desk, no longer trembling, though her heart still felt like a fragile thing. Tae-Jin-sang was standing by the fireplace, the orange embers reflecting in the glass of whiskey he held but didn't drink. The room felt different now, less like a courtroom and more like a confessional. He didn't speak for a long time, the only sound the soft crackle of settling wood. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unbuttoned the cuffs of his white shirt and rolled back the sleeve of his left arm. Nancy expected to see more of the intricate, swirling tattoos that defined his public persona. Instead, beneath the ink of a dragon's tail, she saw a series of jagged, pale lines that marred the skin of his forearm hold, deep scars that no amount of art could fully hide. "My father didn't sell me to settle a debt," Jin-sang said, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from a place far deeper than his throat. "He used me as a shield. Every time he lost, every time the world turned against him, he made sure I felt the weight of his failure." He looked at the scars, his expression one of distant, cold recognition. "I spent 10 years believing that pain was the only thing I was worth. That I was just a tool for a man who couldn't carry his own burden." Nancy took a tentative step forward, her gaze moving from the scars on his arm to the steady, intense look in his eyes. For the first time, the King of Shadows didn't look like an untouchable emperor. He looked like a mirror of her own soul. "We are survivors of the people who were supposed to love us," he said, turning to face her fully. He reached out, his hand hovering near her bruised cheek before settling gently on her shoulder. The touch was devoid of the cold authority she had first met, it was a silent pact between two ghosts. "Your mother took your life and treated it like a chip at a table. She thinks the transaction is over. She thinks she can walk away with the profit of your pain." His grip tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her. "But I don't buy people, Nancy. I balance accounts. And the debt your mother owes for what she did to Elias's daughter. That is a debt that cannot be paid in cash." He looked deep into her eyes, a fierce, protective fire burning behind the darkness. "I promise you, by the time the sun rises, you will never have to look over your shoulder again. You won't just be safe. You will be free. And she will finally understand the true cost of what she sold." In that moment, the last of Nancy's fear didn't just fade, it transformed into a cold, sharp clarity. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the reason the King of Shadows was going to war. The air inside the Golden Dragon Casino shattered as the heavy mahogany doors were thrown open, the storm from outside finally bursting through. Tae-Jin-sang stepped into the neon-lit chaos like a silent reaper, his presence instantly draining the heat from the room. Beside him, Nancy walked with her head held high, the oversized cashmere robe replaced by a sharp, dark coat that made her look like a shadow cast by the man at her side. Evelyn was mid-laugh, her hands buried in a pile of winnings, when the silence hit her. She looked up, the color draining from her face until she was as pale as the cards on the table. The drink in her hand shook, the ice clinking like a funeral bell. Ginseng didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate grace until he stood directly across the table from the woman who had sold his friend's legacy. He reached into his coat and pulled out the thick envelope of cash. The same stack of dirty bills Evelyn had traded for her daughter's life. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the green felt. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud, scattering her chips like discarded bones. "I'm returning your investment, Evelyn," Ginseng said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that silenced the entire floor. Evelyn scrambled to grab the money, her greed momentarily overriding her terror. I don't understand. The deal was done. She's yours now." "She was never yours to sell," Ginseng whispered, leaning over the table until he was inches from her face. His dark eyes were twin voids of cold fury. "You thought you were settling a debt with a monster. But you forgot that monsters have memories." He gestured to Nancy, who stepped forward into the harsh light. She didn't flinch when her mother's eyes met hers. There was no more fear in her gaze, only a deep, crystalline pity. "A mother shouldn't have a price," Ginseng said, his hand moving to rest firmly on Nancy's shoulder, a public declaration of his protection. "But a betrayal always does. From this moment on, you are a ghost in this city. You will have the money, but you will have nothing else. No name, no home, and no daughter. If I see your face in this district again, I will settle the interest on this debt in person." He turned, not waiting for a response, and guided Nancy toward the exit. Behind them, Evelyn sat frozen, clutching the blood money that now felt like lead in her hands. As they stepped back out into the rain, the neon lights of Chicago reflected in the puddles like shattered jewels. Nancy didn't look back. She stood straight, the wind catching her hair, no longer a debt or a transaction, but a woman finally reclaimed. Beside her, the King of Shadows walked in step, and for the first time in her life, the future didn't look like a dark sedan, it looked like the dawn.